I think we're going to begin. Thank you very much for coming to the Dissemination and Implementation Science Study Designs and Methods Workshop, which is the third workshop in the D&I Science installments. We have three wonderful presenters today, and they are Dr. Ranjit Singh, who is the director of the D&I Science Corps, Dr. Bonnie Vest, who is the Associate Director of the D&I Science Corps, and Marissa Camacho, who is the Research Assistant for the D&I Science Corps. They hold many other positions as well, but we want to get started, so I'm going to turn it over to our wonderful presenters.
Thank you, Catherine. Thank you. And thanks, everyone, for joining. Appreciate everyone, especially on a beautiful day outside at the end of the day. I'm Ranjit. I'm here with my colleagues Bonnie and Marissa. As Catherine said, we're excited to share this workshop, which is the third in the series. In the first two, we heard about an introduction, and then we talked about the first one. And the second one, which was just a couple of weeks ago, we talked about theories, models, and frameworks that can really turn our work into science by using those types of frameworks, right? That's what essentially defines the field, is to use those theories, models, and frameworks. But the other thing that defines the field is the types of study designs and methods that we need to use in order to accomplish those goals. And that's what we're talking about today. So the objectives are to, first of all, understand what is different about implementation trials versus traditional randomized controlled trials. So we'll start with that. And then we'll get more into some of the types of study designs and methods that are typically used in implementation science, and that will also help illustrate that as well. So let's go to the next slide. So first of all, everyone knows that traditional randomized controlled trials happen in ideal conditions because they're trying to understand, can this thing work in ideal conditions? You have to start there. And so that's the first step in all of our kind of scientific discovery in terms of developing or testing new types of treatments or programs, is test it in ideal conditions to see if you can get it to work there. The hallmarks of the study design here are that it's highly controlled in order to eliminate kind of extraneous factors so that we can isolate the effects of the intervention, right? That's the goal. The intervention has to be implemented with high fidelity, in other words, as intended. That's really important. And we have to try to control for context to eliminate these other extraneous variables. And so the goal there is it all fits within the idea that it's highly controlled, and the unit of analysis is the patient. We randomize individual patients, and that's the traditional design that everyone's familiar with, is that it's intended to understand whether the intervention can work. But the problem is a couple of main problems. One is that even if it can work in ideal conditions, it doesn't tell you if it will also work in the real world. So we need to overcome that challenge first. And the next challenge after that is that even if it does work in the real world, we have to understand how can we expand it more broadly and make it be adaptable to any real world setting. So these are the two main challenges with traditional randomized controlled trials, is that they don't tell us anything about those two problems. So there are solutions to those. The solution to the real world question is we have to do studies in the real world. So we have to get real, right? So we'll talk about that first. And then the next step is to figure out how do we make it work in the real world. Well, that's where implementation science will come in. So we'll go in two steps to get towards implementation science. The first step is to get real, like I said, and this is something that NIH takes very seriously, and they've set up a whole thing called the Pragmatic Trial. Actually, I'm not sure what the name of it is. It's an NIH collaboratory on real-world clinical trials, and they have a website that's there. It's called Rethinking Clinical Trials, which is actually a good way to think about it, right? So they've come to a realization that we need to be more pragmatic. So we have two short videos we'll show you. The first one will give a quick definition, and then the second one will go into more detail. So let's proceed.
So what do we mean when we talk about pragmatic clinical trials? I think the definition, or what comes to mind to a lot of those of us involved in the collaboratories, and that is it's a large, efficient study that's done in the real world and gives us evidence for adoption of some kind of intervention into clinical practice, or into the way that patients are usually treated when they seek care. We're often focused and should be focused on those kinds of outcomes that are important to the participants in the trial for sure, and also to the decision makers who will use what comes out of the trial to make decisions about the way usual care or the way clinical practice should be changed or modified. These interventions, these pragmatic trials that are embedded by definition, intervene in the routine clinical workflow in some way, and that's an important component of these trials that introduces special and challenging consideration, and then often conducted in very diverse or more diverse study populations than would otherwise be the case in a more traditional trial.
So that gives us a sense of what it is. Now, it turns out that there's a way to think about that, which to systematically identify the various design elements and to adjust those design elements of your study in order to accomplish a more pragmatic goal, which is, does it work in the real world versus does it work in ideal conditions, right? And that framework is called PRECI, and this next video will explain that. So we'll watch that. That's a bit longer.
I want to talk about how we actually design trials that are pragmatic trials and talk through the PRECI 2 tool as a way to really help us design trials that are fit for purpose. There are a few things that I want to really underscore. The first is that line between explanatory and pragmatic, it's a continuum. There are arrows on either end of the line. And to me, that reinforces that trials are not either explanatory or pragmatic, but they are on the continuum between those two. Too often I hear us talk about pragmatic trials as though it's some sort of magical dichotomous definition or a binary. No. And the PRECI tool really underscores the many different considerations.
Sorry, are you guys seeing this video or no?
We can hear it, but the video isn't moving along.
Okay, I'm sorry. Hold on, let me fix that.
It worked fine on the first video, but for some reason this one.
Okay, now do you see the video?
Yep. That go into the underlying pragmatism of a trial. Just to orient everyone, the most pragmatic along each of these axes, the most pragmatic would be at 5. So one could imagine visually a very pragmatic trial looking like the circle, the big circle, whereas as there are less pragmatic elements of the trial along these axes, you get something that begins to look like not a deflated balloon, but maybe a tire that has some flat spots. So, at the top, the question is, who's going to be in this trial? Who's selected to participate? And a really pragmatic approach might be to include anyone in the trial who would ever be a candidate for that intervention in clinical practice, in usual care, right? Almost no restrictions, all in. Now, we can think of all sorts of situations where we'd want to maybe restrict the population, the eligible participants a little bit, and that would bring us in from that outer edge. In terms of recruitment, for those of us who've been involved in explanatory trials, we know that recruitment, sometimes we do a lot to recruit people into trials. The most pragmatic approach would be to say, we take people who are coming into maybe a clinic for their usual care, and those are the people we approach, and we don't go to any special measures to recruit additional folks. In terms of the setting, where are we doing this? Is the setting identical to the setting in which these results would be applied? That would be really pragmatic. We may need to put some boundaries around that, but the most pragmatic would be to say, we're doing it right where these results would be applied. The organization element really gets at what do we actually need, that is in terms of expertise and resources to deliver the intervention. Now, if we need specialized skills to deliver the intervention, and those specialized skills don't exist in usual practice, that's not going to be very pragmatic. But if we have an intervention that can be delivered by people who usually take care of patients and the participants, then that's pragmatic. Now, in terms of delivery, the question here is, can we kind of slot whatever the intervention is into the usual care? So again, we're just using what already exists in that usual care setting, not inserting additional people, if you will, or additional expertise. On the adherence axis, the question there is, how much flexibility do we give? What measures do we put in place to make sure that the participants adhere to the intervention, right? In a highly pragmatic trial, we would just kind of allow for full flexibility and let the end user kind of engage with the intervention and adhere as they would or not, but not put special constraints around that. Now, we can imagine that where we end up on these different parameters will have implications for the results. And so I hope this underscores the importance of all of these factors coming together. With respect to follow-up, the question there is, how closely are we following them up? Or are we just kind of following them up when they return for their usual care? Keep in mind that for any trial, complete follow-up is essential. And so even in the context of a pragmatic trial, we have to make sure we have some mechanism for accounting for everyone who started at the beginning or at some level. In terms of the outcome, relevancy to the participants is really important. Relevancy to the decision makers, really important. Finally, the way we construct the primary analysis. So the most pragmatic approach would certainly be to do the intent to treat analysis. That is, people or groups are randomized, and we do the analysis on the basis of that randomization or the intention to treat. What's really important is to make sure that the approach that you select is the most appropriate for answering your question. There aren't any bonus points for going farther out on the wheel, right? It's not like when reviewers or anyone looks at your trial proposal, you get extra points for being more pragmatic than somebody else. It's really about what is your question and how do you answer that question using a pragmatic approach that best fits the question. And the real takeaway here is that it's a total balancing act. So you want your results to be really relevant to real-world decision-making. You'll probably be trading off some efficiency. Trade-offs abound. They abound everywhere, and we make those trade-offs in the context of the question we're answering. And with all of these embedded pragmatic trials, some have elements that are more pragmatic and some have elements that are more explanatory, and that just speaks to the underlying question.
All right. Excellent. Thanks for listening through that. I find this video really helpful because it points out that in order to do pragmatic trials, in other words, real-world trials, you need to really think about these 9 dimensions that they identify around the circle and make deliberate decisions about
what do we mean when we
Oops. Right. Okay, so we need to make decisions about each of those topics around the circle, ranging from whether it's about recruitment or what setting to study it in, etc., or even what type of analysis to do. So by making those decisions, we can do a pragmatic trial that answers the question we want to answer, which is, does it work in the real world? And if we look at the study design section at the bottom here, we can see how it contrasts a little bit with the RCT study design, right? So the PRAISE-2 identifies those dimensions. And if you want to do a traditional randomized control trial, then you're really going to choose like number 1 and number 2 in the circle. You're going to be really close, and you have a very small circle on that diagram. If you're going to be pragmatic, you're going to be a much larger circle. So That's the idea. And the point is that you can use this framework to actually help guide the decisions and also report the decisions that you made. So if you're going to report the results of a pragmatic clinical trial, ideally you should use this framework and say, we made these decisions about each of these 9 dimensions around the circle. The other things that came up are that adaptation, for example. I'm going to talk about the question of fidelity for a second, which in traditional randomized control trials, we're going for high fidelity because we want to make sure the intervention was implemented as intended. But in pragmatic studies, we have to do something else because we have to realize that in the real world, there's what they call flexibility in the Précis-2 model. But out here, we're calling adaptation, which means that people will end up having to work things out as they go, right? And sometimes things will have to change. So we'll talk a little bit later today about how adaptation needs to be embraced and can be monitored and reported and recorded. So that's adaptation. And the other thing is controlling for context in traditional RCTs. Again, in pragmatic trials, we're trying to do this work in a messy context. We can't control for it. We have to embrace it. And we have models for that, which we talked about last time, like the CIFAR model or the Paris model, but we'll talk more about that in the next workshop 4. Last item on this slide is that the unit of analysis, instead of being a patient, will often be a practice or a clinic. If you're going to do real-world implementation, it's hard to randomize at the patient level. So Bonnie will talk more about that a little bit later as well in the context of cluster randomized trials. So now we know if by doing a pragmatic real-world study, we know that it can work in the real world, but we still don't know how to roll it out and implement it more broadly. So that's how we need to get now into implementation studies. So let's look at the very right-hand column first. The very right-hand column is called implementation trials. And this is where you stop worrying about, does the intervention work? Because you've gotten to the point where you tested it in multiple trials, in ideal conditions and in real world conditions, and you know it can work. Now, in an implementation trial, a pure implementation trial on the right-hand side there, you're going to accept that it works. And you're going to focus only on how can we get it implemented, right? And so we're going to look at different implementation strategies and say, does this implementation strategy work compared to other implementation strategies? And by implementation strategy, I mean a strategy to get this thing used by the people who need to use it. Okay, the implementation strategy is not the same as the intervention, right? The intervention is the thing that we think works, right? The implementation strategy is the strategy we use to get people to use it. So pure implementation trials are only about the implementation strategy, and the outcomes are around, did they implement it? Are people using this new drug? Are people using this program? And you don't have to pay attention to what's happening to the clinical outcomes, or is it actually working for patients? But that's at the extreme end of the scale. We don't do that very often because people somehow still also want to know what's happening with the patients. Are the patients actually getting better? So that's where we get to this middle ground, which is hybrid effectiveness implementation trial. So it's the hybrid between the 2 columns on either side of it. So effectiveness on the left, implementation on the right. We can do studies that try to get the best of both worlds, right? By trying to not only measure the outcomes for the patient, in other words, we still are asking, does it work in the real world conditions? But we're also asking implementation science questions along with that. That's what hybrid trials do. So I'll hand off to Bonnie now to talk more about hybrid trials.
All right. Thank you, Ranjit. So hybrid trials you will probably see frequently appear in the literature, especially around implementation science. So we're going to dive into them a little bit more because we see them very commonly. And framing your study as a hybrid 1, 2, or 3 is helpful for setting it up for people and managing expectations around what your study is trying to accomplish. So there's a couple citations here that are really excellent, sort of the original description of these hybrid trials, as well as a presentation by Jeff Curran, who came up with this framework that goes through these designs. So basically, there's 3 types of hybrid trials, very creatively named 1, 2, and 3. And one is where we're still primarily focusing on effectiveness. So we're still mostly trying to understand if the intervention is effective, but we are also collecting some implementation data along the way so that when we hopefully show the intervention is effective, we're prepared to take it to that next step. And we'll go into each of these a little bit further, but hybrid 2 is more of an equal emphasis. So we have some evidence that the intervention is effective, but we need more. But we're also at a point where we're ready to really think about implementation. And so we're kind of doing both with equal emphasis. And then a hybrid 3 is more towards the further implementation end of the spectrum, where we're really focusing on implementation. We mostly know the intervention is effective, but we're going to keep collecting some effectiveness data along the way to make sure that nothing changes as we implement it more broadly, but we're really focusing on the implementation. So to give you a couple examples and maybe help put some framework around this. So an example of a hybrid type 1 study is the Rainbow study, which was a study looking at a behavioral health intervention for co-occurring depression and obesity in primary care. So the intervention consisted of a 12-month sort of behavioral health coaching for patients, looking at pharmacotherapy for depression as well as behavioral treatments for obesity. And then this was compared to a standard of care where patients were also given a pedometer and information about services for weight management. And so what they did for this study was a cluster randomized trial, which we'll talk about a little bit more in going forward. And the primary outcome here was clinical effectiveness. So they were really looking at, does this behavioral health intervention change patients' mood and weight outcomes? But secondarily, they were doing some implementation work in the background to prepare for real-world implementation, and looking at things like reach, effectiveness, adoption, and maintenance that we had talked about last time with the REAIM framework to kind of identify some barriers that are coming up along the way so that when you get to that next step, you're prepared with strategies to address those barriers. For a hybrid type 2, this study was really looking at implementation of, where is it? I lost it. A motivational interviewing brief intervention for substance use within AIDS services organizations. And so really what they did here is all of the clinics were delivering this motivational interviewing intervention, but then within the clinic, the support that they received for delivering that intervention varied. So some clinics got more resources and support to help them implement this motivational interviewing, and others just received sort of a basic training on the process. And so the outcomes here were co-primary. So one primary outcome was patient clinical improvement. Is their substance use improving? The other outcome was, how effective is this implementation? Are the staff proficient and delivering the motivational interviewing to fidelity? And so they really were looking at these two different strategies. That's the implementation science piece of supporting the delivery of this intervention. And then the last example, the type 3, in this case, the intervention was the COVID-19 vaccines and preventive care services, so something that had already been proven effective. And the goal here was to increase uptake and care and use of the vaccines. And so they used a smart design, which we'll also talk about in a little bit. And in this case, the primary outcome was, are we getting folks, are we increasing uptake of vaccine and reaching more patients? And the secondary outcome was to track patients' clinical outcomes. The implementation science here was testing 3 different strategies. So they had a mobile health outreach means of reaching patients. They had a co-creation of messaging and information with the community, and then they had a more intensive sort of care coordination to help patients navigate vaccine access. And so the focus here was really which of these three strategies is most effective in getting patients to uptake this vaccine, but then they were also examining clinical outcomes along the way. So to sum it all up, in the type 1, right, the goal is still to test the thing and see if the thing works. But along the way, we're doing some evaluation to understand what's happening. And this, you would do a type 1 study when the clinical evidence is limited, but there is some evidence for effectiveness. And you also want to prepare for future implementation. Then a type 2, again, is the goal is to test both things, right? To test the intervention and to test some implementation strategies. And so you are testing those strategies. And you're doing a type 2 trial when you do have effectiveness data, you have some momentum for scale up and implementation, but you do still want to be monitoring effectiveness as you roll this out across different contexts. And then the type 3 is really about testing the implementation. The primary randomization factor or outcome is an implementation outcome. And you're doing this in a situation where you know the intervention is effective, but the challenge is uptake and delivery of that intervention.
Is this a good time to stop and see if there are questions?
Yeah, sure.
Are there
There are
any
no questions in the chat, but if anybody has a question, please unmute and ask. Okay, I think that you may go on.
If you're interested in learning more about hybrid designs, we have a couple other additional resources linked here where you can, dive further into that information. So just some references to have on hand. So as we hinted in those examples, and as Ranjit mentioned, there are lots of specific design choices that get made along the way in designing a pragmatic or an implementation or a hybrid trial. And so we're going to touch briefly on the big picture of some of these things, just so you're familiar with the general concepts. But it's important to keep in mind that each of these really require their own expertise and have statistical implications and complexities that we're not going to get into the weeds of all of this today, but just to kind of introduce these concepts so that when you see them, when you come across them, or you're thinking about a study, you can think about options that might make sense. So these are just some of the things that you'll frequently see in the descriptions of an implementation study. And these things are often combined as well. So within an implementation trial, you might have cluster randomization within a stepped wedge and also be doing mixed methods and qualitative work to assess part of those outcomes, some of the implementation outcomes usually. So these things often get combined in a variety of ways as well. So the first one is cluster randomization, which you may be familiar with, but the idea here is that when we think of randomization, we usually think of the patient and the individual being randomized to either receive an intervention or not. In a cluster randomization, the unit that you are randomizing is not the individual patient, but it's a group or a unit, a larger unit. So it might be like a medical practice, for example. So all of practice 1 gets randomized to the intervention with all of their patients, and all of practice 3 gets randomized to the control. And this could be a clinic, it could be a hospital. I've even seen it could be like a community level or a county level, depending on the study. But all the individuals within that unit then get the same intervention. And so these are often useful in cases where your intervention is at the group level. So if you're trying to implement a new standard of care or a new process or a guideline, because this often introduces a potential for contamination, where if you were randomizing the individual patient, let's say you're training providers in this motivational interviewing that we had in that previous example. If you train the provider, all the providers in a clinic in this process, but then you randomize at the individual patient level, they may integrate some of the things they learned through that training with all the patients, regardless of the patient randomization. It's too hard to kind of keep track of and keep it separate. And so it makes more sense to randomize the whole clinic, train all the providers in one clinic, and not train the providers in the other clinic. And that becomes your comparison. But these kinds of designs do require a larger sample size than perhaps a traditional RCT because of correlation within the clusters. So as I said, we're not going to get too far into it, but there are some things to keep in mind there. And then the next one is the stepped wedge design, which often includes cluster randomization within it, as this figure shows. So in this case, you have each of your sites or your clinics, and then when they receive the intervention is staggered over time through the course of the study. So site 1, everyone starts out in usual care. Then we turn the intervention on in site number 1. The rest remain in usual care, et cetera. So over time, we eventually get to everyone. But each practice then essentially, or each site essentially is its own control from the pre to the post. But then you can also compare all of the usual care period to all of the intervention period. And so just a couple considerations about stepped wedge. This design is often more feasible and acceptable to the community because ultimately everyone will receive the intervention. So you're not asking people to join a study and then be randomized to a control and not ever receive some of the benefits of participating. So it can be more amenable to that. It also allows you to account a little bit for secular trends and changes going on in the broader context because you're looking at the same units over time. There may be other challenges and disadvantages within the stepped wedge, just things to keep in mind around ethical challenges around benefit and consent and, delaying implementation of something that's already known to be effective for some sites versus others. So it really depends on what the intervention is, those considerations. And then in a stepped wedge, you often have correlation not only within the cluster, but also within the cluster and itself over time as you're repeating these measures. So other statistical challenges to arise. So we really encourage, if you're considering any of these designs, to consult with the Bird Corps or another statistical expert who can help sort of account for all of these complexities that often come with these kinds of studies. And I think I turn it back over to you, Ranjit.
Thanks, Bonnie. We can skip slide 19 and just go straight to slide 20, I think, just to keep moving. So this is the concept of adaptation. So if you recall, as I mentioned earlier, we need, if we're doing real world studies trying to understand implementation issues, we need to be able to understand that we can't control everything, right? So instead of kind of just getting frustrated that we can't control things, we should do the opposite. We should embrace the fact that adaptations will happen or adaptations will be needed. Sometimes we can even plan to have adaptations and plan them in advance. Other times they're unplanned. But either way, we need to embrace the topic. So what does it mean? Well, it means that there are 3 types of adaptation that we can talk about. So the first one is changes in the design of the study, for example, allocation or randomization. You might have a situation where you realize partway into the study that the recruitment isn't working out the way you intended, and so you have to change your strategy in some way. So that could happen in any study. But the advantage of thinking about it ahead of time is that you can actually plan accordingly and actually have plans in place for what to do if A, B, or C happens. So that's one concept. And then within this category of allocation or randomization adaptation, there's a particular design I'm going to go over in a second called the SMART design, which was used in one of those studies. So we'll come back to that. But then the next 2 topics I'll go over one by one as well are adaptations to the intervention that people implementing it in the real world may do without your permission, without you knowing, without it being pre-planned, or again, it may be planned in advance if you want to do it that way. That's adaptations to the intervention. And then lastly, adaptations to the adaptations to the implementation strategy. So we'll talk about that as well. So let's go through one by one. So the first one is adaptations to the randomization. So this is an example of a pre-planned an adaptive design. This goes by the name SMART, which stands for Sequential Multi-Assignment Randomized Trial Design. It's a bit of a mouthful, but what it really all simply means is that you can pre-plan that you first, in this case, the R means randomize patients to either intervention A or intervention B. One of them might be control, or most probably in this case, there are two different treatments we're randomizing people to. And then let's look at the A. If a patient is in group A, then we can follow them and see if they respond or not. And if they do respond, let's say their blood pressure gets better or whatever it is we're trying to accomplish, or their depression gets better, then we keep going with A, right? If they don't, then we can switch their treatment and then we can randomize them again to either C or D, right? So other alternative treatments. So this is an example of a trial that could be designed in advance to deal with the fact that some people may be non-responders and have an alternative treatment. So this could be a way of testing multiple treatments in one study. And it mimics a more real-world situation. Because in the real world, when we try something and it's not working, we try something else, right? So why not design a trial that can do that? So that's an example there. So let's go to the next one. Now this one, sorry, it's a busy slide, but I'll walk you through it a little bit. So this is about adaptations to the intervention. So again, if you have a plan that you're going to have a program that involves counseling patients on a certain thing at a certain time in a certain way, then maybe it worked fine when you did it in an RCT, but when you're getting into real world implementation studies, people are having to kind of adjust it as they go to make it work, right? So again, instead of ignoring it, the goal is to monitor what people are doing and document it. And how do you document what adaptations people are making? Well, the answer is you can use a framework. This particular framework is called FRAME, stands for Framework for Reporting Adaptations and Modifications to Evidence-Based Interventions. So, and it takes you through a series of questions like, who initiated the adaptation, right? What is the adaptation? When in the course of the project did this adaptation come about? And where? Is it happening in all the sites, or are certain sites doing this, changing it in this way, and other sites are not? And why are they doing that? And how exactly are they adopting it? And so if you can't see the details here, but you could look at it afterwards when you get these slides. You can see there's basically almost like a checklist or a series of questions to pose and to document, most importantly, to think through and document all of these different factors that might have gone into the adaptation. So that then in a publication, instead of just saying, well, some practices found a workaround and so they implemented it remotely instead of in person, that's okay, but it only gets you so far. It's really, that's a very inexact way of describing it. You can describe that adaptation much more precisely if you use a framework. And this is an example of a framework that's typically used for this purpose. So again, it's to embrace adaptation and document it clearly so that we can understand why adaptations were made. That's part of implementation science, isn't it? To find out how best to implement things. Well, if in a study people adapted the intervention, they made changes to it to make it work, well, maybe that gives us something to study further, to explore further, in order to maximize the chances of successful implementation in the future. So that's adaptations to the intervention. Now we have to talk about something slightly different. And sometimes it's hard to understand the difference. But again, the intervention is the thing that's evidence-based that we're trying to implement. Here we're talking about the implementation strategy. So adaptations to the implementation strategy. So the implementation strategy might have been that you wanted to train the doctors to implement this program of screening for substance use disorder, for example. Maybe you have an evidence-based screening tool, and your implementation strategy is that you train the doctors to use this tool every time they see a patient. Well, that might work, but in some offices they might say that the training was ineffective. They need to add another strategy. They needed a champion in the practice who would actually go around reminding people, oh, they needed an audit and feedback strategy to reinforce the use of the tool. Or maybe the original strategy was to have audit and feedback to give people reports on what percentage of patients they used the screening tool on. But maybe these audit and feedback was going to happen on a 6-monthly basis, but they decided they needed to do it more frequently, right? So these are changes. They're not changing the tool. The tool was the screening tool for screening for substance use disorder. So that they haven't adapted or changed, but they've adapted the implementation strategy. Meaning, for example, they're changing the audit and feedback method, or they're adding in some piece, or they're taking a piece out that didn't work in their setting. So these are called adaptations to the implementation strategy. So along the same vein as the framework, there's a frame IS framework, which is again about documenting and reporting adaptations to the implementation strategy. And it's again to make for more robust research by documenting these things so we can learn from it. Right? So does anyone have any questions about that?
Nothing in chat.
Okay. All right. That means we can move on to Marissa. Thanks, Marissa.
Thank you. So I'm going to be talking about community-based approaches to research. So just like with the rest of pragmatic and randomized control trials, this is going to be kind of on a spectrum. So you have at the very bottom, you have community education, which is just research is communicated to the community in traditional forms of outreach. And then you have community-focused research, which is research that is undertaken for the community to help fill a knowledge gap identified by the community that you're working with. Community-based research is going to be research that is undertaken directly in the community to improve the knowledge of local conditions and local issues within that community. However, community-based participatory research is research that is undertaken with the community as a partner, an equal part of the entire research process. And your partners can be organizations, can be different groups, agencies, institutions, or even individuals in the community. And just like with everything else, there are people at the University of Buffalo that specialize in this. So one of those resources for you, if you're interested in community-based participatory research, is going to be the Community Engagement Core through the CTSI. Next slide, please. And then again, just going over kind of the general spectrum. So you have the initial is going to be outreach, which is for intended communities and takes place in community settings where you're kind of like recruiting. And then you have consult, where community informs your research, so you can hold a focus group or a community forum, and then you can get your research topic based off of that feedback. And then you have community advisory boards, which are kind of like a part involved in the research, but they're not necessarily a part in planning it. And then you have collaboration, where community participates and contributes to the research that ends up being implemented. And then shared leadership is going to be the community-based participatory research, where the community partner is involved in all aspects of the research. And to give you an example, I wanted to just quickly touch on a research that I was on as a research assistant with Dr. Amanda Ziegler through the Department of Family Medicine and her work with Health Science Charter School in Buffalo. And it was developing appropriate school-based food literacy initiatives for Buffalo teenagers. So we met bi-weekly with teen ambassadors, and the teens told us what they like and what they don't like, and what they know and what they don't know about food literacy and nutrition education. They helped us develop topics and questions for a school-wide needs-based survey. And then once we developed those initial questions, I wrote them up kind of in a survey format and then brought it back to the teen wellness ambassadors so they could edit it. We handed out physical copies. They made a lot of edits on my wording, making sure that it was teen-friendly wording and making sure that the amount of questions were appropriate. They gave a lot of great feedback. And then we gave that survey to the school, that needs assessment. And then when we got the results back, we presented them to the teens, and then they helped us interpret those results and, more importantly, the lessons learned and what to do different next time. And then from that needs assessment and with those teens, we developed hands-on food literacy-based activities and lessons that we ended up doing in the school, partnering with the health sciences charter nutrition teacher. And then we, in partnership, we aligned those sessions with the students based off of their feedback and their interests, as well as the teacher's curriculum and lessons for that week, so that the nutrition education that was required was not, let's say, put on hold for our activities. We made sure that it aligned with the teacher's curriculum in partnership. And then for a couple of those food literacy sessions, we also partnered with a local Buffalo chef who had a previous partnership with Health Sciences Charter. And then we brought that chef in to do hands-on cooking lessons with the nutrition students. And then throughout this whole process, we provided the students to give us feedback and their opinions on the sessions and how we could improve further. So now I'm going to hand it back to Bonnie.
All right. Thanks, Marissa. And we mentioned the community engaged research because it's often a component that you'll see within implementation studies, because as we're thinking about moving these interventions into the real world and adapting them to different settings and populations and contexts, there's often a process of engagement at some level across this spectrum that Marissa described, where we're getting feedback from either the providers who we, want to implement the intervention, or from the patients to make sure that from their perspective, it's meeting their needs. So you'll often see community engaged pieces embedded within implementation studies to help understand those specific contextual factors from the perspectives of the people that live and work in those spaces. And along those lines, another piece that you'll often see embedded in implementation projects are mixed and qualitative approaches. And qualitative methods and how they are used in implementation science could probably be an entire workshop series on its own. So we're just going to very high level sort of brush the surface here. But qualitative methods are often used in implementation research because they're helpful for understanding all of these sort of complex contextual factors and processes, usability, perceptions, all of those things that we've talked about over the last couple of workshops, that qualitative methods can really help us. So when you're thinking about, for example, the CFER framework that we talked about in the last workshop, where you're really trying to understand all of these different multi-level barriers and facilitators and how the culture of the particular clinic that you're implementing in might impact, how the intervention is implemented. Qualitative methods are really helpful for getting at some of that information and understanding how all those complex pieces fit together. So you're often most commonly seeing things like interviews and focus groups being used in implementation research. You'll also see sometimes observations or even ethnographic approaches. There's a lot of us anthropologists working in implementation science because we're trained to understand complex systems and how factors at different levels relate to each other. So sometimes that's occurring. And also potentially qualitative methods like doing secondary analysis of text sources like meeting notes, policies, workflows, other types of things. And I will say, in terms of writing implementation science projects, often qualitative methods are sort of get included in their own aim. It's sort of the third aim of qualitative implementation methods. We're commonly now seeing people using what are called rapid qualitative methods and approaches, which allow for a little bit faster turnaround of qualitative information so that you can feed those results back into quality improvement and other processes over the course of an implementation. So thinking about some of that adaptation that Ranjit talked about, sometimes we're using qualitative methods in that way to help document that adaptation, document barriers and solutions, and then share that information back to participants in the study. Qualitative methods and implementation studies often also occur at multiple time points over the course of a study. And so we'll talk a little bit more about that in the next session on barriers and facilitators, but you might want to sort of reassess at several points throughout an implementation. And there are various methods for doing that. And we're often combining multiple qualitative approaches within the same study. So there was a VA implementation trial that I worked on, where we started with focus groups at the beginning of the trial to identify sort of people's early perceptions and what they saw as potential barriers. And then we used rapid approaches to feed that information back to the trial so that they could help implement the intervention more successfully. And then later on during the trial, we did individual interviews with the providers who were in the trial to help identify factors that arose as they actually used the intervention in practice and how it fit into their workflows. So that's just one example of how those things may be combined. Excuse me. And so I think that's another good point to pause and see if there's any questions. I see there's a couple things in the chat. I don't know.
Nothing question related to things that I
Oh, it's just you. Okay. All right. Does anyone have any questions or thoughts? I know we threw a lot of information at you fairly quickly. As we said, each of these things could probably be their own more in-depth session, but we just wanted to really introduce all the different concepts today. Anyone have any questions?
I have one question.
Yeah.
This is Jennifer Livingston. I'm at the School of Nursing. I use a lot of qualitative methods. I have not heard about rapid qualitative methods. Could you just tell us, I know you, just a little bit overview of what that is? Thank you.
Yeah. So it's, I mean, when you think about traditional qualitative work, right, you're doing an interview, then you're having it transcribed verbatim, then you're putting together all of your transcripts and doing, very thorough line by line coding, for example, and other types of analysis. A rapid approach can be rapid in a couple different ways. So one thing we do sometimes in these implementation studies is forego the transcription phase and just use like detailed notes from the conversation to help feed back into the next approach. There are also what are called rapid analytic approaches where you still have a transcript, but you are generating a summary of each transcript's content. And then using that summary, we would put the summarized content of all the interviews into a matrix and then use that to review and identify themes and ideas that are coming out. So I can share some resources with you if you're interested, but it's still qualitative data. It still takes time, but it's relatively rapid compared to some other approaches. So, yeah.
Thank you. Have you used Intellectus at all, which is like an AI? A colleague and I just started using this. It's like an AI program that will look at your transcripts and then you can put in like the prompts, like what you want it to look for in the data, and it can yield those themes. I mean, you still have to do some interactive and stuff with it, obviously, but
yeah.
I don't know if
I have not personally myself, but I know that's definitely also a direction that the field is moving to, using AI in different ways to help support the processing of all of that data, because it can be very time consuming. Yeah.
Thanks.
So yeah, I'd be interested to hear what your experiences are with it offline as you're using it more, because it certainly does come up a lot now. Okay. So now we're going to shift into a more interactive activity to kind of think through some of the things we've been talking about. Ranjit, I'm thinking since we have a smaller group, maybe we just stay in one big group and talk about it together rather than breaking out.
That sounds good.
Okay. So we have an exercise, which Catherine, if you can put that document in the chat.
It's already there.
Okay, perfect. Um, so there should be a Word document in the chat. So we can forego this part about introduction and a reporter for the group. But basically what the document gives is an example of a study, and some questions that the study is trying to answer, and then some prompts to think about, based on the information provided, how might we design an implementation study to understand these questions. And actually, since we're here, since we're staying in this group, I can share it on my end as well, the document. And there's no right or wrong answers for this. It's more just an exercise to start thinking through some of the things that you might consider as you're thinking about designing an implementation study. So we can be broad, but just the important part is to think about what decision you make and why we're making that decision. So
Bonnie,
the
could you
study,
possibly increase the size of the font or the page
yeah, if I
at the
can,
bottom?
yeah, I know. I just have to move the Zoom.
Yep,
The
no
Zoom
problem.
bar is always in the way.
Thank you.
Okay.
That might be better.
Yeah. Okay. So this is an example adapted from a published study. The citation is at the bottom of the worksheet, but basically they're implementing and evaluating a multi-level pilot intervention study to increase uptake of HPV vaccination among adolescent patients across multiple rural federally qualified health centers in California. So their primary goal is to increase HPV vaccination initiation and completion among rural adolescent patients. And then their secondary goal is to understand which of the implementation strategies works best and why it works best. So the implementation strategies they used are included here. So pre-implementation, they did a steering committee with researchers and the clinic's medical director, and they did focus groups with rural Native American parents and caregivers to get feedback on messaging around HPV vaccination, and how they should be talking to parents about HPV vaccination. And then to actually implement this in the FQHCs, they did a couple of different implementation strategies. They had tailored vaccination reminder postcards that were sent to the parents of adolescents. They did training for primary care teams in the clinic, with that audit and feedback that Ranjit mentioned. So quarterly reviewing that data and those completion rates and providing feedback. And then within each clinic, identified a physician champion to kind of help lead all of these efforts within their clinic, and provided visual reminders like posters and handouts and things around the clinic. So that's sort of a quick overview. And so what we would like to discuss as a group is to think about, if this is a study that you were designing, where you're trying to implement this intervention to increase uptake of this vaccine, what are some of the design considerations we might make? So, what kind of study would this be potentially? What kind of design factors might we include? And what sort of methodologies might we use to measure those outcomes? So anyone like to chime in? Any thoughts on sort of this first one, the overall study type that might be suited to answering the questions of this study? Scroll back up to the information here. Yeah, please just feel free to unmute yourself then.
I would say, well, it's definitely not a hybrid one. So I would probably say 2, because whilst they are going out to try and understand, to evaluate the strategies, which ones, which one gives the highest initiation and completion rates. There's also the element of evaluating the effectiveness of the implementation strategy itself.
Mm-hmm.
I know it's not one, so somewhere between 2 and 3.
Right, because we know HPV vaccination is effective, right? So they're not trying to test whether the vaccine is effective at preventing HPV, right? They're trying to test how do we get people to uptake this effective intervention, right? Any other thoughts? Like, again, there's not really a right or wrong. It's just different things we could think about, right?
I think you could actually do it as a pure implementation study where you only care about implementation. You don't worry about any downstream effects, right? Because you take it for granted that the HPV vaccine is effective. So that was the extreme right-hand side of the table. So that's another possibility, I think.
Mm-hmm.
If you need the slides to help you answer the question, I put them in the chat.
Thank you, Catherine. Okay, so we're thinking some sort of hybrid trial and more towards the implementation side of the spectrum than the efficacy side or effectiveness side of things. How about thinking about, so we're implementing this across multiple clinics and there are sort of multiple different levels of activities and strategies being used. So how do we think might be the most effective way to design this study in terms of thinking about randomization considerations or testing different strategies? What would we think? Any suggestions?
Hi, this is Lisette. I'm not sure if I'm answering your question, but as you know from previous workshops, I'm interested in conducting a study on vaccinations. So this is very interesting to me, and I actually worked with healthcare providers on HPV and promoting HPV vaccinations in their clinics. So the first thing that comes to mind is just identifying their workflow and how these different strategies are going to work into their workflow, because if it doesn't work for them, then it's just not going to be effective in increasing the vaccination rates. Mm-hmm. And then you can also think, I guess, for hybrid 3 about effectiveness, I guess maybe longitudinal studies to show, what the rate of cervical cancer is for these patients, many years later. But I don't know if I'm on the right track, but that's just what I was thinking.
Mm-hmm. Right. So yeah, no, absolutely. And I think that indicates, right, maybe pre-implementation, we need to do some some more. I think that there's a little bit here, but maybe some more engagement to understand the contextual factors and, like you said, the workflows and the provider perspective about, were the strategies to give them training and review data, do they think that's going to help? Or is there some other issue out there that these strategies don't address, right? So I think that's definitely could be a component of it to get that feedback from the providers and the clinics about is the problem that you don't remember to recommend HPV vaccine to your patients, so putting a poster in the exam room is going to help. Maybe that's not the problem, right? So understanding some of those factors ahead of time would be a good component.
I really like that idea, Bonnie. You described it as pre-intervention. It's basically means preparation for this trial. So we talked about, we're asking questions around how would we design the trial, but I think what we've hit on is that maybe there needs to be some work to design these interventions more carefully before doing a trial to test them, right? And we don't know. In this case, maybe they did extensive work to come up with this suite of strategies, right? This 3-layered cake, if you will, of strategies. Maybe they did extensive work to come up with that, but maybe they didn't. Maybe they just thought, oh, that sounds like a good idea, right? And we've all done that before. I certainly have been involved in studies where we had a great idea. We said, oh, we'll just implement this and see what happens. Well, it doesn't work as often. But if you engage with people ahead of time and design it based on their needs, then it's more likely to work. So that's all pre-implementation work that I think we'll touch upon some of that type of stuff actually in the next session, I think, right? By looking at,
Mhm.
right, by using a framework like CIFA, for example, to understand either the patient's workflow and barriers and facilitators, or the primary care team's workflows and barriers and facilitators, or the clinic at the clinic level, whatever level, understanding what's going on, what the context is, and understanding what might work for them, and then coming up with these intervention strategies in this table, instead of pulling them out of thin air, pull them out of the results, design them based on the results of that pre-implementation work. So that's a really important type of implementation science work. That is to prepare for a clinical trial by designing an appropriate implementation strategy. So thanks for bringing that up.
Mhm.
But if we accept that maybe they did some work to design these, then I suppose we could ask the question, how should we test them? Right? When you were getting at, I think, some possible options, Bonnie, I think. Like, do you want to randomize at the patient level, or do you want to do cluster randomization? That might be a topic worth discussing.
Mhm.
Was that the next question?
Yes, I think so. Yeah. Mhm. Yeah. Any thoughts on what might be appropriate for this, to do cluster randomization or stepped wedge or some of those other approaches that we talked about?
So kind of just feeding off what we were just talking about, I think that the smart design could potentially work for this. So obviously going in with all of that pre-implementation work, and figuring out what could work and having potential options, to kind of go through that smart design and then randomize differently, depending on what's working.
Okay. Yeah. So maybe start with the reminder postcards. And if that doesn't work, then something more intensive happens, right? Based on that.
Was this more than one clinic? I think you said it was more than one
Yes.
clinic, right?
Mhm.
So
Yeah.
I
Multiple
mean,
clinics.
okay, so you had mentioned earlier that you can train all staff in one clinic to administer one intervention, and then in the other clinic down the road or whatever, they
Mhm.
would provide usual care, right? Whatever
Mhm.
standard practices they use. So I would do it that way so that there's no contamination.
Mhm. Yep. That's definitely another approach that would work. And we could think about that within that. Do we randomize at the clinic level for the entire study? Or do we do that, where you're in the intervention or you're in the control for the whole time? Or the other option there would be to do that stepped wedge approach, where every practice eventually gets this support and these interventions, but we just phase it in over time across the clinics so that there's some comparison preserved there. There's two different ways that you could do it, and pros and cons probably to both. So
I noticed that one of the objectives, or I think it was a secondary objective, was to tease apart which intervention works better. And so, because sometimes when you have a multi-level intervention, you're trying to test them as a constellation, as a group, right? We're going to try, if you do this whole multi-level intervention with these 4 or 5 things, does it work as one package? But here we had this secondary goal, which is to evaluate which one works best and why or how. How are we going to figure that out if we're doing everything? But I think we suggested one option for that already, which is to, what was it? Yeah.
the smart design.
Yeah, the smart design. There you go.
Mhm.
There you go. I should have remembered that. Yeah, so the smart design might be one way to tease that apart. Other ways?
Anyone have any thoughts?
I had a crazy idea, which is that maybe you randomize at the practice level for the practice level intervention, right? So for the primary care team in the clinic, that's all done at the practice level, but maybe within each practice, some parents are randomized to get the poster card and some are not. And maybe that could tease apart the effect of the postcard separate from the other things. That's one way. But the other way, I'm wondering, Bonnie, if there's any qualitative methods that could be used to try to tease apart what the mechanisms of what was happening.
I'm just wondering, can you ask people what caught your attention?
Yeah.
Was it the poster? Was it the card? What was it that really caught your attention? Some people might not know. Like, I would know what caught my attention. And I would be able to at least vocalize that.
Yeah.
Yep. Yeah. I mean, that's definitely a place where qualitative could come in with either the parents or the patients or the care team. You know, to get feedback on these different pieces and see which one they felt like was most helpful. That could differ by site too, right? So one clinic, it could be the data that was really helpful, seeing the data, and the other clinic could have had a really engaged and passionate champion who was very active and encouraging all their colleagues, and that was what sort of activated everyone at that clinic. So it can vary by clinic as well. So qualitative is helpful for understanding that as well and how things may be different in different settings. I think the other thing you could do is randomize clinics by strategy. So you could have one clinic where you just do the postcards, one clinic where you maybe just do the three clinic-wide trainings, and then another clinic that does the trainings and the data, you know, so you could also split the strategies up and test each of them separately or in some combination.
Yeah. We didn't specify here how many practices there were, but if you had 20 or 30 practices, you could probably randomize into groups, as you said, right? With 5 or 6 practices in each group. That could be an interesting.
I like the stepped approach. I think because if you randomize treatments to one to each practice, there could be differences amongst the practice cultures. So, and you wouldn't really know that. So I think that stratization, stepwise stratification seems to be a way around that.
Yeah, absolutely. Right. It could be because the postcards didn't work, or it could be because some idiosyncrasies of the patients in that particular that got mailed those, and it changed how they responded to them. So yes, absolutely. And that's again where there's a role often along the way, no matter how you design the study, to do some sort of process or qualitative. It doesn't have to be qualitative, but some sort of process work along the way to help understand some of those and document those factors that might be at play, because we often see that in this work. You know, we do the same thing for all the practices, even if they're randomized. All the intervention practices get the same thing, and some of them do better than others. And it could be because site A had their office manager leave and 2 of their providers during the period of the study. And, you know, site C, as I said, had a really enthusiastic champion who really jumped in, whereas the champion at site B wasn't as active and engaged. So there's all these other factors that we often are trying to document and capture to understand along the way, because it might not necessarily be the strategy. It might be these other factors that we have no control over in the real world, like turnover. Or we had a study once where I think there was a hurricane, or not a hurricane, a tornado or something that damaged half of the clinic during the period of the study. So of course they were not too concerned about implementing our our guidelines, because they were dealing with a much bigger issue. So, you know, all these things happen. And so then it's partly also just documenting it to understand what's going on and why they were or were not successful.
Yeah, this is the messiness of the real world, right? Which in the past we've just tried to ignore, but now we're trying to embrace and understand and think it through. And
you know, practitioners have different levels of experience. They have different qualities of interaction. There's so many factors,
Yep.
even if
Exactly.
you're set up the perfect design.
Someone needs to come up with a framework for that.
It's in CFR.
Yeah.
So any other, I think we're coming up on time. So any other final thoughts or questions or comments at this point?
No questions in chat, but please feel free to unmute and go ahead and ask. Or if you need to put it in chat, I'll be happy to read it for you. We're getting thank yous, so I'm thinking that we are okay.
I'm excited that a lot of the topics we talked about today, especially with the qualitative stuff and CFR and all of that, will come up more in the next workshop. So
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
I missed the last session. Is there a way to get the recording from the last session?
Sure, I can send it to you.
Oh, thank you.
Yep.
Yes, and feel free to reach out to us at any point with additional questions or follow up about any of the things we've touched on.
Thank you.
thanks everyone for your participation. It was great to hear the discussion.